Alright, hey, so I'm going to do another short reading today. This is going to be one chapter, it'll be chapter 5. It is a shorter chapter, so uh, that'll get us through chapter 5 going into Tuesday when I will pick up with chapter 6 and possibly parts of 7. There are 40 chapters in this one, so it does take a bit of a while to get through, so hopefully by the end of the summer, but I may have to do some reading going to the fall. So, Neep had set herself apart from the rest of the group for some time, wandering the lengthy perimeter of the oasis camp. She was confused and upset, though she could not exactly understand why. Seeing others like her here in the desert mingled with the Malarians and foreigners and among themselves had disturbed something deep within her. Neep had not really known her parents, or could not remember them, at any rate. She had lost them so young, and all that had been in her life since then had been Diaga. There had always been Diaga. But now she could see that was changing. She had seen the way he looked at the other human woman, understood that there was a connection there that she could never have with him. When she saw that there were other Firecats, many others, it had simply driven home the realization that she was not unique, that there were others like her, and she might not be so special to Diaga and his friends as she had come to believe. Neep was intelligent enough to understand she was different and that she was not quite as equal in the eyes of the people her lifelong companion had befriended. But the thought that she could be replaced, that Diaga might simply choose another like her, had driven her to an immense sadness. Yet there was curiosity there as well. She wandered somewhat aimlessly for a while, then determined to find and watch some of her kin. She located a camp, a simple fire set at a small distance from the water, and from behind some protruding rocks she observed them. They were like her, and also very clearly not. They moved mostly on two legs, and she noted that they seemed to be a bit thicker muscled in their hindquarters from doing so than she was. Neep had always favored the ability to shift to all four limbs for speed and stealth, but she saw few of these Firecats doing so. They were also seemed to favor the more elaborate clothing, almost to a degree that would have been considered fashionable. There were silk wraps and ties on many of their arms and legs, as well as about their waists. The most fascinating thing, though, was that they did not speak. Neep was confused, but then she noticed that they were using hand gestures to communicate. The deft, human-like front paws of Firecats can execute many complex motions, and it was in this way the group seemed to be talking to one another. Neep had always struggled to share her thoughts with Diaga. Perhaps this was the way she could learn to reach him. She shook her head in annoyance. She should be learning to move on from him, not try to find new ways to bond. Neep was certain that her connection with her oldest friend was breaking, and she was attempting to steel herself against the pain of losing him. She eventually abandoned her point of observation as darkness began to fall. She was unable to interpret the signals of her kin anyway, and despite her sense of isolation within the group, she knew nowhere else to go. Stalking back to their shelter, she checked in, unseen, on the two children, Nawandel and Samuel. Assured they were safe, she found the tent housing Diaga and the others. She curled up outside the entrance, wrapping her body into a ball after setting her straps and weapons in front of her within easy reach. The tent flap opened, and Diaga was standing beside her. Neep, where have you been? I've been worried about you. She gave no response, physical or otherwise, and Diaga knelt by her side and stroked her fur. What's going on, Neep? You seem upset by those other Firecats. I thought you'd be happy to find others like you, a whole crowd of your own kind. It might be a chance to reconnect with some of your family. Maybe we can even find a link to your parents. Neep's head came up slightly, and she glared fiercely at Diaga before settling back down again. Diaga sighed and sat next to her, his hand resting on her back. Neep, I don't know what's wrong, but please, whatever it is, don't go off like that again. I can't do this, any of this, without you. If you want to go back to your own people. There was a catch in Diaga's voice, and Neep's head came up again, her eyes wide this time. Well, I won't stop you, but I do need you. You're my oldest and truest friend, and I think it will be very important to have friends in the coming days. I could not ask for one better. Neep held Diaga's eyes, then she came up on all fours and, in the same way she had once done when they were both younger, wrapped around his back and set her strong shoulders where he could rest his head. Warm in her protective embrace, Diaga laid down at the entrance of the tent, and soon the two of them were fast asleep. As he had promised, Wrath brought two other Malarians to speak with the party the next day, not long after they had risen and eaten fruits picked from nearby plants. A bit of guidance had been required from the Watchers guarding the oasis and its precious resources, but they had been patient and helpful, if mostly silent, throughout the ordeal. Trem was chewing on a bulbous, pulpy fruit, one whose taste he did not especially like, but found quite filling. Joven and Grimtooth were beside him, seated on the ground with their elbows on their knees, also chewing the odd food speculatively. They were the first to meet the newcomers, who were dressed similarly to Wrath, but in robes of different colors and, in the case of the listener, clearly less practical for moving around the endless sands. Trem took a liking to the other Malarian, the Traveler, as Wrath referred to him almost immediately. His name was Udo Ibvat Ein Helme. Trem was beginning to learn, with a significant degree of assistance from Wrath, how Malarian names worked. Ib meant son of, and Ein meant daughter of. In the case of Malarian men, they always had both titles listed in their full names, but a Malarian woman would only refer to her mother's name in her title. Culturally, women in Malaria were revered and considered more essential to the preservation of traditions and of the dominion of Malaria itself. though thus far Wrath had not explained why that was. Udo turned out to be a much more talkative individual than Wrath, though it was not a difficult feat to accomplish. He explained that his duties involved taking many journeys to foreign lands to learn languages, customs, and histories. Udo was an older man, over 50, and was nearing the point where he might no longer be sent on such adventures. He seemed wistful as he explained his time as a traveler was ending, showing Trem many items he'd woven on his brown robes to mark his various journeys. Udo's last trip had been across the Syrian Sea to the Vastness, a lawless land that was a desert much like that of Southron, but in Udo's mind this was where any similarity ended. I must admit, he said with a wry smile, I do not regret that I will be spared to return to that place. It does remind one of the joys of coming home. The other Malarian was not nearly as forthcoming in conversation. She was dressed, contrary to Udo, in a brilliant blue robes that kept her face covered, while the traveler seemed to enjoy revealing his freckled cheeks and graying curls of short hair atop his head. Trem learned only by observing their conversations among one another that she was Wena Ein Uari, and there was little else to discern given her preference for silence. Udo seemed to like her, but it also appeared that Udo liked everyone and everything. He even had a disarming and kind smile for Ghost, who was so taken aback that he could not help but return the favor, if a bit half-heartedly. Udo had sat and talked with them casually for some time, then a light tap on his shoulder from Wena seemed to signal the matter of the hour was at hand. He handed his share of fruit back to Joven and stood, brushing dust from his brown robes, and examining the stitching of several of his heirlooms. Well, he said happily, we should begin, I suppose, though there are some here who do not require an examination for the Dominion, I believe. Udo looked at Wena for approval, and for only the second or third time she spoke in a calm, even tone. Trem Waterhound and Javaneleth of Bladehelm are welcome in Ulinar. Trem and Joven exchanged a look of puzzlement. How did you know my full name? Trem asked. I never gave it. Udo grinned. The listeners have a bit of magic in what they do. Now who would like to talk to me next? Ghost was quick to step forward. I have to go into the city. I'm in need of information on a particular item and where it can be found. It means everything to me. Once again it was Wena who spoke. No, Greymane Squall, you may not enter. Ghost's eyes widened first in surprise, then in anger. Before he could begin to argue his point, Trem sat forward and said, Can I seek what Ghost needs on his behalf? Udo seemed ready to answer, but the Napoleon dropped into a crouch and whispered to Trem, These damned fools cannot keep me out, not after all this. I know what this means to you, Trem said softly, but we're lucky to be getting the opportunity, and if I understand Logan correctly, Wrath sacrificed much for us to be here. I'll find what you seek if you'll only tell me. Ghost glared at him, but reason seemed to take over. To Trem's surprise, he did not argue further. All right, Half-Elf, we can talk later, and I'll give you the particulars of what to find, but if you fail me, I'll kill you myself. Trem did not answer as Ghost straightened and stormed off. Diaga stepped forward next and said, I would dearly like to enter the city with Neep, and attempt to connect her with some of the other fire cats within. Ah, Udo smiled. She is loyal to you, young man. A good sign. He made several motions with his hands to Neep, but the fire cat simply stared at him in confusion and perhaps a touch of embarrassment. But she does not know the art of hand speech. You must take her then. Udo seemed to remember that it was not his decision and turned to Wena. If it's permitted, of course. The cat is allowed. I would like to know more of the man. Diaga looked at her eyes, the rest of the listeners shrouded in blue cloth. I'm a mage, primarily gifted in ruination magic. I've studied the arcane for most of my life, but I aim to use my magic to do good in the world. We in the Dominion have little use for the arcane, Wena said evenly, but there is no lie in your words. If you promise to abide by our laws, I will permit you to enter Ulinar. There was no lie in Ghost's words either, Joven interrupted. How did you choose not to let him accompany us? Wena turned to Joven and said coolly, Not all lies are told in words. He cannot enter. Logan and Grimtooth were standing a bit behind the others. The knight cleared his throat and said, I think it might be best if Grim and I stay here, with the refugees, if the rest of you are going. That seems unnecessary, Diaga said. Caliandra could remain here if you both wish to go. I could, Caliandra said, giving a stern glance to Diaga, but I was hoping to visit the temple of my god while we were here. I'm not likely to have another opportunity, and the temples of Ulinar are said to be the most favored by the immortals. Yes, Udo confirmed, the Dominion of Malaria prizes the worship and honoring of all gods, mighty and meek alike. It would be a pilgrimage few ever managed to make, and one true servants to the immortals prize over all else. It would be a shame for you to miss it, priestess. She may enter, Wena intoned solemnly. As I said, Logan interjected, looking very uncomfortable and stumbling a bit over his words. I think we should remain, for the good of the group, you understand. I'm sure our absence will not offend our hosts. Wena Ein Uari looked piercingly at Logan, and he found he had to avert his eyes. She continued to stare silently for some time before finally saying quietly, I believe Logan Hawking is quite wise. It would be good for he and his blood brother to stay. Logan bowed to the robed envoys from Ulinar, and then he and Grimtooth departed. Joven studied the others who had been granted entry and said, So when should we leave? Udo smiled kindly. We can depart now, if you like. Wayne and I will be your guides into the city, and, if time allows, while we're within her streets and squares. Wrath, Trem turned to their unlikely savior. Are you coming? The black-clad man looked at Trem, but said nothing. Udo cleared his throat and said solemnly, "The Watchers are not permitted to enter Yulinar. They serve as guardians, but are not considered full members of the Dominion any longer." Trem sensed it was not the time to ask why Wrath wasn't allowed to enter the city, lest he embarrass his savior. Javetalus seemed desperate to know more, but he accepted what he was told for the moment. Caliandra excused herself to gather her belongings and say goodbye to Nawandel and Samuel, while Diaga and Neep went to pack their small bags as well. Trem and Joven stayed, already carrying everything they would need, and bid Wrath thanks and farewell. The Watcher gave no response, walking softly off towards the refugees. Udo watched him, a sad look on his face. Joven could contain himself no more and said, "Udo, why can't Wrath enter Yulinar?" It was Wayna who answered. Wrath Ibathor Ein-Alman committed murder and chose the Watchers over exile from the Dominion. Murder? Trem was confused. Isn't he an assassin of sorts? This time, Udo offered an explanation. For you foreigners, it's hard to understand. When the Dominion of Malaria was first formed thousands of years ago, there was constant violence in the endless sands, as our people fought over the meager supplies of water and food. The most powerful of the savage groups was led by a monstrous figure called the Lord of Skulls. Some say he survived for hundreds of years on the atrocities he committed, but our historians believe the Lord of Skulls was more of a title, taken by whoever commanded that troop at the time. Regardless, he was eventually overthrown by the blessed coming of the Sun King. The Sun King was just a boy, but the god of light and sun, Hyannis, spoke through him, and it is with his guidance that we were able to found and construct Yulinar. By his teachings we worship and respect all the gods and thank them for the salvation of our people from a dark and endless cycle of violence and bloodshed. That is why in the Dominion all violent crimes carry a sentence of exile or entry into the Watchers. So there's no violence in Yulinar, Joven said, somewhat disbelievingly. What about theft or other misdeeds? We have many laws on those matters, Udo answered with a smile. But most illegal activity comes with penance in the form of public service. Repeat offenders are exiled, if deemed necessary. No executions, then. No, Trem Waterhound, Udo answered him. We will not commit a violent act even in the face of wrongdoing to one of our own. That is our way. But if you exile your people, Joven said thoughtfully, are you not just issuing a death sentence that takes longer to carry out? All exiled men and women are given a few days' supplies, and many are provided additional aid by friends or family. Some choose to leave with their kin, though it is rare. A few days' supplies. Trem looked out at the ever-rolling dunes around the oasis. I doubt I'd make it a single day in this vastness. Udo gave that disarming smile once more. But you're not a Malarian. Ah, here are our mounts. A watcher came over to them leading large and funny-looking beasts, the like of which neither Trem nor Joven had ever seen. Diago arrived soon after and seemed greatly enthused at the sight. He called the unusual creatures camels and assured his friends that they were very useful for crossing dry deserts due to their ability to retain water. Trem found the long necks and rising humps on their backs made them look humorous rather than noble, as he believed horses to be, but he saw how the Malarians treated the creatures with real esteem and respect, and wisely held his thoughts to himself. The group was joined by a few fire cats who volunteered to pull Trem along in his makeshift sled, and after some additional reinforcements to the frame to ensure it would hold up at the increased pace, they set out. Neep seemed unwilling to approach her kin, who were very curious about her, especially her clothes and weapons. While they were modifying the sled, Trem had clumsily half-rolled and half-dragged himself off of it and into the shade of a small palm tree. His legs had regained some of their movement, but he could not bend his knees, and even mild flexing of the muscles caused immense pain. He was resting mostly to give the throbbing of his limbs time to subside, stubbornly refusing to let Caliandra or Diaga help him any further. A shadow fell over him, darker than the tree created, and Trem looked up to see Ghost holding his sheathed sword by the scabbard and looking down at him. You were supposed to tell me when you were leaving, half-elf. Well, we haven't left yet. Ghost ignored the flippant remark and crouched down next to Trem, squatting on the balls of his feet and watching the preparations. I should be going, but since you rightly pointed out that we are fortunate enough to be given the chance, I will trust you to do this. First, he passed Trem his sword. See if you can get a replacement for this. He tossed Trem a small pouch of coins. That's all the money I have left. Spend it on yourself if you come across a bargain. Trem looked at the weapon and the coins. Udo told us there is no violence in Yulinar. Why would they have swords for sale? Ghost snorted. They may say there is no violence, or that it's illegal, but all these black-clad stalking shadows have weapons. There must be a way to get one, for a price. Why do you need one? Didn't you just have this made on our way to Delmore? Ghost picked up a handful of sand and let it run slowly through his fingers. The blacksmith there was no expert in weapons. I had to practically guide his hand myself. He saw that Trem's inquiry was deeper than he had voiced. My weapon I lost at Gylakil was given to my ancestor several generations ago, and I trained with it my whole life. It came from Southron, from the Sun People, and I deeply appreciate having one of its like back in my hands. Trem nodded in understanding. And what of your other need? Ghost dropped the sand and wiped his hands against one another before sitting down. He sighed and looked longingly at the gathering group of travelers. Then he turned his head and met Trem's eyes. I told you before that we're looking for weapons, imbued by the gods themselves. In Yulinar there were supposedly 2 accounts of such things, according to my father's records in Glaciar. From what I could tell, they're the only accounts that exist. Then I'm looking for books, not the weapons themselves, Trim asked. Yes, books, scrolls, fragments of either, anything referencing the names Adal or Adwel ibn Hazrad Ainafir. They would have descriptions of an event called the Immorbellum, a time of war among the gods themselves. Supposedly they were able to learn something of this conflict that exceeds what we perceived here on Tethtinir. For something like this, Diago would be a far better person to ask for help. I know, Ghost said, but the boy, rightly so, does not trust me. He might listen to you. He has to. Ghost pulled from his pocket a waxed piece of paper on which he'd written in a careful hand the names he'd told Trem. Take this, give it to the wizard, and bring back whatever you learn. And if I learn nothing, don't let it come to that. Ghost stood without further comment and was gone. Trem watched him, then tucked the piece of paper into his shirt. Trem looked back at the party, now almost prepared, and waited as the Firecats came over to him and lifted him as gently as they could, setting him down on the sled now padded with fine woven blankets. Udo glanced down at him from his camel and said, I thought you might appreciate a bit more comfort. Now we should be off. It's a full day's ride, and we're starting later than is preferable. Without any more delay, the camels were kicked into a steady trot, and the Firecats gripped the ropes and hauled Trem along at a decent pace. Whenever they reached a steep dune, two more would take up the handles at the back and lift him bodily, carrying him over the expanse until they were on less extreme terrain. Trem hoped that he could be healed in Ulinar, for he was growing tired of his need to depend on others merely to get around. The sun was high in the sky as they made their way quickly to the east. The oasis soon lost to sight behind them. Back at the encampment, Logan was watching the refugees from a small distance, sipping on his water skin and brooding. Grimtooth walked over from the others, who'd been helping prepare a small meal, and turned to follow with his eyes those riding away with his blood brother. Logan said nothing, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and turning his eyes to the sky. Grimtooth refused to let what they were both thinking go unsaid. I think you could have at least asked, Logan. To what end? Logan replied evenly. If we were refused, then the whole group would know I had something to hide. If we were admitted, well, then we leave these people alone with Ghost in charge. No, it's better this way. Is it such a bad thing for them to know what you did? Logan looked at his companion incredulously, but Grimtooth's eyes were serious, and he seemed to believe what he said. We, are Anglo-Daics. I know it's not your true home, but you understand we're meant to represent. I can't err in any way. I must be the beacon of hope and righteousness that I'm charged with by my title and my name. Bah! Grimtooth waved a huge hand at Logan in disgust. You've always said you believed the code to be mere flexible, and I think you're afraid, Logan, and I understand, but it didn't matter to them that be with us. One of them suspects something already. Logan's eyes followed Ghost, now moving among the refugees and gathering his share of the rations. The knight straightened and began walking back towards the group. I won't give him the satisfaction of knowing the truth. Grimtooth sighed, utterly exasperated by Logan's decision, and moved to follow him. So that's going to be it for today. Just a quick episode for Chapter 5. Because Chapter 6 doesn't have a convenient break at an earlier point, it's just one longer chapter. I'm going to try to do that and possibly parts of Chapter 7 on Tuesday. So, as always, you can follow me on @LegacyChronicle on Twitter, and you can go to the YouTube page for these videos once they are no longer available on Twitch. Shouldn't be any interruptions except possibly next Sunday, and if so, I will do the same thing I did this week, which is I will just reschedule a live read for a different day or time. Thanks for listening.